right. Well, thank you for the songs this morning, and appreciate Joe's been working really hard to uh, figure some of these things out and to kind of figure out what all we can do and how it can be a benefit to us. So I really appreciate that, and we'll have a fancy new system, and I guess in the next steps we'll have to have a fancy new pastor to go along with it, so we'll see how that goes, I guess. All right, we're going to Matthew 17. This is message number 42 in our series through the Gospel of Matthew. Title of this message is Fishing for Faith, and we're going to be looking at verses 14 to the end of the chapter in verse number 27. So as we get started here, I'm going to read verses 14 to 16. And when they were come to the multitude, there came to him a certain man, kneeling down to him and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is lunatic and sore vexed, for oft times he falleth into the fire and oft into the water. And I brought him to thy disciples, and they could not cure him. Well, at the end of chapter 16, Jesus promised that some of the 12 would not die before they would see him in his kingdom glory. And the implication of that, of course, was that the rest of them would die without seeing it. This prophecy was connected to the revelation of the mystery of the kingdom, that the kingdom would not come with Jesus' first coming, but would come after a long time with his second coming. Well, rather than establishing the kingdom, Jesus is more progressively revealing to his disciples that he came to suffer. He came to be killed. He came to be buried and to rise from the grave after 3 days. So this prophecy that Jesus had given was fulfilled by Jesus taking Peter and James and John up into a high mountain, possibly Mount Hermon, given the vicinity where they were, and him being transformed before them into his glorious appearing, the way that he will, in fact, return when he comes to this earth to establish his kingdom. Moses and Elijah also appeared and talked with him about his coming death. And then Peter spoke up to Jesus, and he thought that this event, that this what they were witnessing, signaled the beginning of the kingdom. And God spoke then from heaven and directed them that they were to obey his beloved son. And particularly that would apply to how that his son had begun to prepare them for his death. So on the way down from the mountain, they're asking Jesus about the scribes and how that they taught that Elijah must first come. And, in their minds, you can see how they're trying to put these things together because they had just seen Elijah. And yet then he was gone, and then the kingdom is not here, and it's not coming right now. So why did they say Elijah must first come? And Jesus said, well, Elijah does come first. And he points them back to the rejection of John. It brings them back again to that concept of rejection and suffering in this first coming of Jesus and in this age before, in fact, he returns and the kingdom does come. So when they get down off the mountain and they rejoin the other 9 disciples, they meet a large crowd of people. These people have obviously found the disciples. They've found Jesus, as continues to happen for quite some time. And Matthew gives us, beginning here with verse 14 in chapter 17 and to the end of this chapter, he gives us 3 episodes that finish out this chapter, and the next chapter begins another larger teaching section. And so as we look at these 3 episodes at the end of chapter 17, they are certainly all connected by the theme of faith. Something about faith is involved and is prominent actually in these particular episodes. 2 of them are miracles and the other is actually a death prediction by Jesus. And when you read this chapter, and particularly these three events, you might read them very quickly, and it might seem like that they're somewhat random, or perhaps unrelated to each other, or unrelated to what came before, or unrelated to what comes after. It's actually not the case. When you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke all together, they all have the account of this healing of this demon possessed boy, which is the first instance in this little series here. They all have that account, and they all have it in their gospel accounts right after the transfiguration. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have Jesus predicting his death right after casting out the demon out of this boy. And they also, if you look ahead to the beginning of chapter 18 here in Matthew, they also all have this debate among the disciples about which of them would be the greatest in the kingdom as the next episode. Now, the only difference is that Matthew has another incident here. After the healing of the demon-possessed boy, after the death prediction, and before the disciples' argument about which of them is the greatest, Matthew has this incident pertaining to the temple tax and the fish with the coin in its mouth. And in fact, he's the only one that gives this account in his gospel. And there's certainly, when we read that, something odd about that story. So, what is the message in this section, and how does it relate to what came before and what comes after? And that's what we're going to see as we go through this. So, we'll look at each incident, verses 14 to 21, where we see lacking of faith, verses 22 to 23, where we see reality of faith, and verses 24 to 27, where we see fishing in faith. So we're going to start looking at each of these episodes. We'll begin here with verse 14, this account of the demon-possessed boy and the lacking faith of the disciples. So verse 14, and when they were come to the multitude, there came to him a certain man, kneeling down to him and saying. Well, Mark and Luke both make this immediately explicit that Jesus and the three returned to the other disciples, the 9 that they had left behind. Now, it's clear in Matthew's account that they came back to the other disciples, but it's not as immediate. We find out later when they asked Jesus privately for certain that they were there. Mark and Luke both make it immediately clear. Now, Luke also adds in his account here that it was the day after the transfiguration that they returned to the 9 and the multitude. So it seems like when we look at these accounts that Jesus and the 3 were gone apart from the other 9 for at least a little bit of time. At least it would seem like it would be 2 days, maybe 3 days. Certainly seems like it could have been a few days. But it was the day after the transfiguration when they rejoined the other disciples and this large crowd. Now, also, when you look at Matthew's account and you compare it to Mark's, Matthew's account is about a third of the length. It's a much, much briefer account than what Mark has. And when you read and you compare the two, it's evident that each gospel writer selected the episodes that they're going to put in, and I'm not trying to discount the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. I'm just saying as they put these works together, they are selecting particular events. And I think it was John that said something about this. If all the things that Jesus said and did were written, you couldn't contain the books. So they selected certain episodes. They put them in a certain place, and even in those episodes, they brought out and highlighted certain things that happened and maybe not as much with others. And this is a good case where you can see that happening. So when we read Matthew's account, we can see that he puts actually much less emphasis on the miracle itself. It really just gets one line in the account that he gives us. There's much more in Matthew's account around the surrounding discussions pertaining to faith and the nine's inability to cast out this demon. So, verse 15, this is the man that came to Jesus speaking, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is lunatic and sore vexed, for oft times he falleth into the fire and oft into the water. So this man has come to Jesus because his son was possessed by a devil, by an unclean spirit. And you see this word lunatic that's used here, and the word in the Greek actually that's used, essentially it means moonstruck, literally. And really what it is, it describes a condition that was associated with insanity, that was commonly attributed to the moon in old times. But what is described, and when you look at all the accounts, you can get a fuller picture of the things that are going on. What is described are some sort of epileptic-like seizures that this boy is experiencing. And what we know from the account is that this is due to a demon, actually, that has possessed the boy's body. And so these seizures, they had him falling into the fire, falling into the water. I mean, clearly the demon had the malevolent intent to hurt or to destroy this boy. Verse number 16, and I brought him to thy disciples, and they could not cure him. And some of the other accounts sort of bring out that it seems like there's a crowd here, but there's sort of a disturbance in the crowd. It's obvious that something's going on when Jesus and the three get to this crowd. And so this man had come seeking help for his son, but the other disciples were not able to cast the demon out. Verse 17, then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him hither to me. So Jesus responds, and really he responds by addressing the crowd. But even in this address to the crowd, there certainly is some words of warning to his disciples. And he uses this language that is very reminiscent of that generation of Israel that came out of Egypt and ended up dying in the wilderness because of their unbelief. And particularly if you look at like Numbers chapter 14 and verse number 11, it's very similar to Jesus' statement here. And Jesus also uses this language of how long, and we've encountered that a number of times in the Psalms, looking at Psalms of lament. And this is certainly not a lament, but it indicates that also that Jesus is not going to continue to be with them. He's not going to continue to suffer them. There's a time that he's going to, but that time is going to come to an end. So this obviously connects with, again, the mystery of the kingdom and that of the increased emphasis that Jesus is making on his soon coming crucifixion. Now, this was a strong warning also to his disciples. Don't be like that generation of Israel, but rather be believing. And of course, that's precisely where they failed in this incident. In verse number 18, and Jesus rebuked the devil, and he departed out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. So Jesus spoke a rebuke to this demon, and of course, the demon obeyed and left out of the boy. And of course, Matthew highlights the immediate result of the healing, immediately. So this man had come to the apostles, and we're not told what they may have tried, how long they may have tried. We don't know. It seems like they at least had given some attempt to be able to cast out this demon, and they just were totally unable to do it. And Jesus speaks these words, and of course the demon obeys, and immediately this boy is healed. In other words, the demon is cast out of him, but also the effects that have been brought on his body by the possession of this demon are reversed. He is cured. And again, Matthew really doesn't put a lot of emphasis on the miracle itself. This is his statement about it, and then everything else that we read really has to do with the issue of faith. Verse 19, Then came the disciples to Jesus apart and said, "Why could not we cast him out?" And so now, sometime later, after this has been done, the disciples, they came to Jesus, and again, this would be the nine, though the other three were probably with them as well, but the nine were the ones that had tried to cast out the demon and had not been able to. And they asked Jesus why they weren't able to cast out this evil spirit. Now, something as we've been going through Matthew that you may have noticed or you may not have noticed, but Matthew hasn't really made a lot out of the disciples performing such miracles. He certainly has talked about Jesus performing miracles, but the disciples did perform such miracles. And they were given authority from Jesus to do so back in chapter 10, in verse 1 and verses 7 to 9 in particular. This was a part of the mission that Jesus had sent them on. It's a part of the office and the calling that they had as apostles. He gave them authority to cast out demons, to heal all manner of sicknesses and diseases. And they had certainly done so, but they encountered this case, which was apparently a hard case for them. And for some reason, they were not able to do what they clearly expected they would be able to do. But they weren't. And they could not cast out this demon. So they're asking Jesus now privately, essentially, tell us why we could not do that. And in verse number 20, Jesus said unto them, because of your unbelief, for verily I say unto you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. So the problem, Jesus says very plainly, it was their own unbelief or their lack of faith that was the problem. So it seems like that their struggle to put these things together, from the Old Testament and what Jesus has been revealing to them, it was hindering their understanding of what their mission really was as apostles. And it's coming out in a lack of faith. In other words, there's a connection here between a lack of understanding. And actually, when you read through Mark's gospel, when you're in this section of Mark's gospel that has this account, Mark has a heavy focus on the disciples, on their lack of understanding and Jesus' discipleship of them. Matthew is not putting as much emphasis on that, but we know that it's there. So their lack of understanding is actually hindering faith in this case, to the point that they weren't able to do something they should have been able to do, something Jesus had given them the authority to do, and they weren't able to do it. So Jesus compares in this passage, he goes on to compare faith to a mustard seed. Now, we remember back in chapter 13 that Jesus gave a parable about the mustard seed in chapter 13. And I'm not saying that these are equivalent, that they're not. But the point is that the properties of the mustard seed served for that parable that Jesus gave. And it's the properties of the mustard seed that Jesus is also using here to illustrate the principle of faith that he is seeking to emphasize. So one of those properties is the fact that the mustard seed that is being referred to here is an extremely small seed. And this extremely small seed grows to a fairly sizable bush or shrub, or you might even consider it a small tree. And among the class of plants, if I'm using that term properly, or family, and I get those confused oftentimes, but whatever the family of plants or the class of plants or whatever it is that this belongs to, it's the largest of those that grows. So this is a property of this seed that, and again, it was good for illustration in the parable. It's good for illustration here. Well, so what the point is that it's not about quantity. It's not about having more faith. It's not about having larger faith. It's not about the size of the seed, or in this case, again, of the faith. The second property of the mustard seed, which is just like all the other seeds, is that the seed brings forth after its kind. Now, that's a general principle that actually is referred to in many different places in the Bible. Paul picks up on that fact actually to use it to illustrate resurrection and things about glorification and immortality and things like that. But it is a property of a seed that the seed produces whatever plant that the seed is. That's just, now sometimes you might plant something and something grows that you didn't expect, but that means that you had a mismatched seed. You had a seed that was something else other than what you thought it was, because the seed produces the plant that it belongs to. And so that is the other property. So even though it's small, even though that seed is small, it will grow into the mustard plant. And so the point here is that it doesn't matter how small that the seed is, as long as it's a genuine seed. As long as it really is a mustard seed, it's going to grow into a mustard plant. And so it's not really about quantity or magnitude of faith. It's about quality of faith. It's about nature of faith, being true faith. That is the point. So about faith, Jesus said that if they had true faith, even a pure faith, or a faith that isn't hindered by this lack of understanding, that isn't mixed with lack of faith or unbelief, if they had even an amount of faith like that small seed, Jesus said they'd be able to move a mountain. Well, that expression, it was common idiomatic expression for a long time within Judaism. Essentially, you can move a mountain, what have you, saying that anything is possible or nothing is impossible, that sort of thing. It was a very common expression. So the disciples had been given authority to cast out demons, to heal sicknesses and diseases, but they hadn't been able to in this case because Jesus says they had lacked faith. Now, the message that is drawn from this passage oftentimes is see, we can do anything if we just have enough faith. We just have enough faith. We can accomplish this. We can see this. We can see that. Well, that isn't exactly the message that is being conveyed. And it's because, again, it's not about amount of faith. It's about the nature of the faith, the true nature of the faith that one must have. This faith is faith in Christ. Now, before the transfiguration, Jesus gave a prediction of his death that met with the disapproval of his apostles. And in fact, Peter spoke up about it, very unhappy with that sort of a prediction. And then God speaks on this mountain when Jesus is transfigured and gives a command that you are to obey my son. And this is particularly in the sense of the commands that he had given, his prediction of his death. So you may hear it oftentimes said, well, if you just have enough faith, you can have better health. You can have a better house. You can have a better job. You can have a better car. Whatever the case may be. If you just have enough faith. But what that thinking misses is what is really at the heart of what Jesus is saying, and that is the nature of that faith. Because if you have true faith, the right kind of faith, then you will seek his kingdom first. And you're not going to be driven to consume based on your lusts. In fact, James even addressed that in his letter, talking about how that many times you ask and you have not because you've asked wrongly. You've simply asked out of a strong desire or a lust for something that you have had and it hasn't been granted to you. Well, then what's the issue? Well, then again, the issue is that you don't have the right kind of faith. Verse 21 says, "Howbeit this kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting." So they had lacked prayer and fasting, showing that their faith was lacking. And in the context, it really doesn't seem that Jesus is indicating that there was some sort of special prayer that they should have prayed, like there was some sort of formula that they should have used. It doesn't indicate that, but more of the practice that was lacking. Well, then we get to the next brief episode. It's just 2 verses here in verses 22 and 23, where we see something about the reality of faith as it comes back here. Verse 22, "And while they abode in Galilee, Jesus said unto them, The Son of Man shall be betrayed into the hands of men." So they have returned to Galilee from Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus again uses this title, Son of Man, to refer to himself. And Son of Man has significant connections with the coming kingdom. We've talked about that numerous times before. And here Jesus is connecting this title with the prediction of his death and his suffering. And that shows that his death and suffering are also a part of the purpose for his kingdom to come. And you notice that he uses the language here of being betrayed. And that word, I mean, it just literally means to be handed over, to be given over. I'm going to be given up, he says, into the hands of men. And of course, that becomes clear later on with Judas Iscariot and so on, but we can see it here. Verse 23 says, "And they shall kill him, and the third day he shall be raised again." And they were exceeding sorry. He will be killed, which indicates, again, he will be executed. He's going to be handed over and killed, is what Jesus is telling his disciples. And then, of course, he also predicts his resurrection. And we read how the disciples were really grieved by this. And they don't seem to register the objection with him like Peter did before, but they were very grieved at him saying this. Now, when we look ahead, and you just skip ahead there just to the beginning of chapter 18, when you look ahead, you see these same apostles arguing amongst themselves about who is the greatest in the kingdom. And that shows us that they obviously at this point still have not put all these things together properly. And this is certainly a part of the lack of faith that they were rebuked for. In other words, if you have faith, then you believe Jesus' word. Jesus says he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be handed over, and he's going to be killed, and he's going to be buried, and he's going to be raised again the third day, then you believe. I'm not saying that you may not be saddened by that, but you believe what Jesus is saying. You don't have objection to it. And then we get to this last account. And again, Matthew, the only one that gives us this, beginning in verse number 24. "And when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, Doth not your master pay tribute? So they have returned to Capernaum. So you can tell they've been in the far northern region of Israel, up in Caesarea Philippi, up near Mount Hermon, somewhere all the way to the north, near to the border with Syria. And they have been coming back down. Of course, they're ultimately working their way toward Jerusalem, but they've been coming back down. So they're in northern Galilee. They've come back to Capernaum on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. And this question comes up about this tribute. Now, what's being referred to here is the temple tax. And every Jewish male over 20 was to pay this temple tax annually for the maintenance of the priests and for the temple services, such as cleanings and animals that were for general sacrifice purposes and things like that. And you can see that established in Exodus chapter 30 and verse number 13. And it also was reestablished after the return from exile. And you can read about that in Nehemiah chapter 10 and verse number 32. Now, obviously, this temple tax that was for the males of Israel above 20 years old to pay yearly, the priests themselves were exempt from paying this. And in that day, in this time that's being written in that day, the tax that was levied was 2 drachmas per man. And the collectors that are being referred to were Jewish collectors that were connected with the temple. So these are not the publicans that were working for Rome. That's a different tax collector. These are the collectors, again, connected with the temple. These have been the Jewish collectors. And this wasn't a Roman tax. And this didn't go to Rome in any way. It went to the treasury at the temple and was to pay for the priests and the services of the temple and so on. Now, this tax, as I understand it, was usually collected when the people would come to Jerusalem, not like for the feasts and what have you. And there were these chests in the temple in Jerusalem where this would be placed. And it doesn't really seem like, from what I have looked into it, that it was extremely common for these collectors to travel around like this and especially to go to Galilee to collect this tax. It was generally brought to Jerusalem. So it just sort of has the feeling of the possibility of a setup. It could be some way trying to entrap Jesus, and of course, if that was the case, they failed to do so. But this collector, he asks Peter about Jesus. Does your teacher pay this tribute or this temple tax? In verse 25, he saith, yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, what thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? So Peter said that he did pay it, and then he returns to the house. And the word prevent is used in a very old, archaic sort of meaning. We don't use it that way anymore. Essentially, Jesus knew about this exchange, and so he initiates this conversation with Peter, and he asks him this question about the kings of the earth, and who do these kings of the earth take taxes from? Who do they take tribute from? Do they take it from their own citizens or the conquered foreigners? And that's really the point of the question that Jesus is asking. So, if you think about the Roman Empire and how they had spread out. And so when they would conquer another nation, they would receive certain tribute from them. And that particular tribute is what's being asked about. Do those kings take that from their own citizens or from the foreign citizens, the nation, the conquered nation? And of course, they take it from the conquered nation. That's the point of the question that Jesus is asking. Verse 26, Peter saith unto him, of strangers. Jesus saith unto him, then are the children free. So the answer was obvious, and of course Peter answered it correctly because again it was an obvious answer. And Jesus said, then the sons are free, or the you might think of it as the citizens of the kingdom. They're not required to pay that sort of tribute tax when they conquer another land. Then verse 27. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea and cast a hook and take up the fish that first cometh up. And when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take and give unto them for me and thee. So Jesus continues as he gives Peter this question, and Peter answers the question. Jesus gives him this consequence, and then he says, essentially, nevertheless, however, we should avoid offense. And that word, of course, means to cause to stumble. It's like, tripping somebody up. And in this case, they probably would have provoked the leaders of Israel both unnecessarily and untimely. And they would have given them something to accuse Jesus of. And we know that they were watching Jesus closely and constantly on the lookout for something that they could bring against him. Now, having said that, Jesus has made clear that he's not under any obligation to pay this. In other words, he's not violating any law of God by not paying this. He would not have sinned had he not paid it. But he says, in order to avoid offense, he tells Peter to do what he was told to do. Go fishing. And this first fish that you catch will have a coin, a stater, in its mouth. And what I understand is that a stater would be worth about 4 drachmas. And so Peter was to pay that for Jesus and for himself. And that would have covered the temple tax for both men. Now, again, Matthew is the only one that gives us this particular account. And there's just some odd things about it. One of the most obvious is that it doesn't have an ending. In other words, Jesus tells Peter to go and catch this fish, and the first fish he catches is going to have this coin in its mouth, and take that and pay. But that's it. Like, we're not told anything further. Well, Peter went to the sea and cast in, and the first fish he caught, lo and behold, it had this coin in its mouth, and so he took it and paid the tax. We're not told that. It has no ending. One of those kind of stories that people usually, they either love or they hate, because a story like that is just open to interpretation. Some people hate that and can't stand it. Some people love it. But nevertheless, that's what we've got here. It's kind of odd. It just doesn't have an ending. And there's of course a tradition of people arguing this and that about whether or not Peter did this and what happened and whatever. And I think they're missing the point. So I'm not suggesting that Peter didn't do it. I'm just saying we're not told. So in other words, what Peter did after this really isn't the point of this account. I believe that he did do it. I think that's implied by the story, and that he found just as Jesus said. Now, something else that's especially odd in this story is this comparison, this question that Jesus asked Peter. He makes this comparison that would seem to put Israel, and especially the rulers there in the temple, in the position of a conqueror, and Jesus and Peter in the position of conquered foreigners. It's a very odd comparison. And really, it's very odd to think, why did Jesus bring the kings of the earth and their conquered peoples? Why did he bring this into it at all? What does this really have to do with a temple tax that the males of Israel pay to support and to sustain the services of the temple? Well, notice that phrase that Jesus uses, kings of the earth. And it's actually a phrase that we can find used in the Old Testament and has some rich usage in the Old Testament as well. And specifically as it pertains to the Son of Man and the kingdom, because that certainly is in the context. So think about, in one place, Psalm 89 and verse number 27. Now, Psalm 89 is all about the covenant, the Davidic covenant, God's promises to David. And they're sort of interwoven in that psalm as you read through there. There's promises to David and then David's son and so on. Now, this is what God says to David, Psalm 89, verse 27, also, I will make him my firstborn higher than the kings of the earth. And we can actually find several messianic prophecies that speak about that when the Messiah reigns in his kingdom, he is the conqueror. He is the conqueror. He conquers all the nations of the earth, and they pay tribute to him. not the other way around. One instance would be Psalm 72, verses 10 and 11. The kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts. Yea, all kings shall fall down before him. All nations shall serve him. We have the great messianic psalm in Psalm 45 that speaks of him as receiving all of these daughters of the kings of the nations as essentially a tribute to him. So in other words, Jesus' choice of language and this illustration that he is using should have emphasized to Peter that the kingdom had not come, or else he would be receiving tribute and he would not be paying it. Now, when we read this series of events, and we read it with what came before, the transfiguration, and prior to that, when Jesus first makes this prediction about his coming death, and we read about what comes after, and that starts there in chapter 18, which Lord willing we'll look at tonight as they're arguing about which one of them is going to be the greatest in the kingdom. When we read this in line with this section, this account, we can see Jesus is preparing his disciples for his departure. We've talked about how we get that turn, Peter's confession in chapter 16, and as you look at Matthew after that point, that Jesus is giving special time and attention to his disciples to prepare them for his departure. Why? Well, one of the reasons is because it's going to happen, and another reason is because they've got a job to do. They have been called to fulfill the office of apostles, and they're going to do that after he has departed. So Jesus is preparing them. And what we can see as we read through here is a lack of faith on the part of the disciples. Again, in their understanding, they're not putting these things all together properly. And it's manifested in that failure in particular. So Jesus is showing them the consequences of the mystery of the kingdom being delayed because Israel was not ready to receive her king. So the disciples, they need to believe his words. They need to embrace the office and the work that he has given them. And they will, but it's going to take a little while before they get there. And so one of the great messages that we see in a passage like this is that having faith means believing and obeying Jesus. It means trusting him. It means taking his word for what it is, whether that seems to line up with what we think or what we like, or maybe even what our circumstances might be, or what it seems like is going on in the world. We must believe him. And so when we think about faith, faith's not about the strength of our desires. It's not about how strongly that we want to be given something or how strongly that we want something to be removed. It's about understanding his purpose for this earth. It's about understanding his kingdom, and that our lives are a part of that in this age that we live. And that's why he gave messages about this present age and not putting it before the kingdom. And again, it also assures us of this message of expected suffering and persecution and such all the way throughout this age until he comes again. All right, that's all of the message for this morning. We will close with a hymn.